How are you?
I'm very well. I'm excited to hear your talk.
You are very kind. um, Actually, should I do an audio test just to...
Yes, you're actually projecting through the room.
There's no, like, speaker system? That's fine.
You can try plugging in this audio.
Oh, do shut up, Leopold.
That will do. Just the audio test.
It works.
All right, yeah, no, we should. Are you guys all here for musical messaging?
Yeah.
Come down. It's an intimate chat. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am very well. Hi.
Yeah, right?
And is DJ still here? No? I guess I'm going to assume that we're ready to go. Awesome. All right. Well, hi.
Hello.
Hey.
How is everybody today?
Great.
I feel like I'm running a marathon. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. And a great big thank you to the FIG folks for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Eric Hamel. I'm a freelance sound designer, composer, game designer, and the audio fellow at a very small indie studio in town called Worthing in Moncrief. And I've had the great pleasure of working in game audio for about 5 years. I've worked with a really handful of studios, doing some really fun projects with some really amazing people. And I am here today to talk about music design and how we can sort of push the envelope and use music to communicate with our audience in interesting and meaningful ways. So, and I have a lot to get through in the next hour, so if you forgive me, I'm just gonna dive in and hit the ground running. So, first of all, I want to start by acknowledging that there are a great many things that go into creating a really interesting and exciting and effective musical game score, and we're not going to be discussing most of them at all. Today we're going to be focusing on how we can use music itself to craft a better experience. So we're going to first look at how music functions, and it is a personal opinion that I think in the industry we too often look to cinema as to how music should function in games, but I'm going to embrace that for the purposes of this talk, and we're actually going to look at how it works in cinema, and then we're going to look at the ways that games are actually different. And we have, I'm sure you all have guesses about what that is. And then we're going to talk about how we might use music better in our interactive experiences. So, diving right into that idea, Aaron Copland, American film composer Aaron Copland, identified these 5 things, these sort of 5 pillars of the ways that music enhances film. And just hitting them all, the first one is to create a more convincing sense of atmosphere. Usually that's sort of a time and place. So, for example, if your film or your game is a Western, and it's a sort of a cowboy-themed game, you're going to have a certain style of score. Like it's going to have probably lots of strings, guitar, maybe harmonica, that sort of thing. Something that really sells the audience on the location and the time. It's very evocative of that sort of thing. The second is to underline something psychological. So a good example of this is that moment in Jaws when you see the people splashing around in the water and you hear that da-na, da-na, and it signals to the audience that there's something else going on. There's something underneath the surface of this psychologically. And the third thing is to build a sense of continuity. This is used a lot in terms of montages. So to connect a series of events or ideas, composers will use a piece of music to sort of unify that experience. And the fourth and the fifth, I like to lump together because of a recent, well, not too recent video that was posted on YouTube. So to provide a sense of finality in the piece or a sense of triumph, and also to fill the silence. Now, how many people saw that video someone posted of the ending of Star Wars A New Hope when they pulled out the music? Who saw that? Anyone see that? It's, if you haven't seen it, go look it up. It's so uncomfortable. It's so crazy. I mean, you know, so you've got Han Solo and Luke Skywalker walking down this like audience filled with people, and like you can't, there's nothing that, you hear nothing. Like someone coughs, I think, or something like that. Without the music, like there's no sense of ending, there's no sense of triumph, and like you really notice the empty space. So, anyway, so these are sort of the 5 pillars that Aaron Copland distilled about 100 years of film scoring to these 5 things. And I think that there's one missing for game audio, but for games, we definitely have a lot of common ground between film and games. There's a lot that we can learn from, and I actually think that we can actually use all of these in games. But it's in a film. What are we scoring? It's the action, it's the dialogue, it's the script, it's the story, right? But in a game, what are we scoring? I mean, the story and action and dialogue are also very important, but I would argue that it's actually the play and the mechanic that really needs to be scored. And games aren't films. We experience them very differently. Our brains actually experience them very differently, and I will touch on that just a tiny bit. Because there have been a handful of studies that have been done on how audio and music affects players, and the results have been very, very mixed. The one thing they all seem to agree on is that more study is needed. Lots of varying results, and it would take far more time than I have today to go through all of them in great detail, but there were a couple of points that I thought were actually really useful and somewhat consistent. So music consistently involved players in the experience and had often a physiological effect. So some games that are designed to really get your heart pumping, like maybe it's a racing game or something, like the music is instrumental in getting the player to really get involved and get like hyped up because the music tempo is really high. And at the same time, though, that also can hinder the player's performance, which is a really interesting element. Also, as human beings, we tend to have a pretty low bandwidth, and we can only kind of focus on a certain number of things at one time. And some studies suggested that music tends to get tuned out when players really need to focus on something, and it requires high concentration. I also think it's important to acknowledge that the studies that I looked at, and most of the studies that are out there, really concentrate on first-person shooters, racing games, high-action adventure games, that sort of thing. Lots of combat, but games that require like really quick response times and really high concentration. But I could find almost no studies that focused on point-and-click adventure games, or puzzle games, or roguelikes, or turn-based strategy, that sort of thing, where the player has the chance to step back and sort of relax and really like think about what it is that they're doing. So I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about something that I think is very important to game audio design, and that is wine. No, it's true in this case, actually. So contrastingly to game studies, there have been a number of studies that have been done in advertising on how music affects people, and not just in terms of the film aspect of advertising, but also in location-based retail experiences. And I just want to briefly mention one study that I think is actually really important. The Journal of Applied Psychology published a study about themed music that was played at a wine shop. And what they would do is they would play certain music on alternating days. So they would play French music on certain days, and then on the alternate days they would play German music. And on days that they played German music, they sold much more German wine than French wine. And on days that they played French music, they sold twice as much French wine as German wine, which is really fascinating because it suggests that even though customers, and I think in our case, players, they're not paying direct attention to the music, it doesn't mean that it isn't having an effect on their choices that they make. So, we're still learning about how games affect people, how they're during the process of being played, and how audio affects the players. And I would love to continue studying that, honestly, if I had the time. Someday, maybe. So we've talked a little bit about how music works in cinema, and some studies on maybe how music can affect people and possibly players. So let's start talking about the difference between movies and games just a little. And I'm sure everyone in the room is aware that games are interactive in a way that movies are not, right? Our audience has agency. And while I think that's really simple in principle, I think it's really key in terms of crafting a really effective game score. So film composer Bernard Herrmann has been quoted as saying the above, that music is the communicating link between the screen and the audience, reaching out and developing all into one single experience. And I think this could be even more true for games than it is for film. And I think for me, the key word is communicating. I think the one thing that game scores have the potential to do that the cinematic music does not is communicate with the audience to potentially affect the outcome of the experience. And this is because the audience we're composing for actually has agency. They can change it if they want to. So I've started approaching game scores from this perspective, and in such a way that it communicates with the player to provide relevant information on which they can act. And there are a number of obstacles to this in the development process, quite naturally. I think, so in my experience, many designers, actually quick show of hands, how many are composers and sound designers in the room? How many are developers, game designers, producers, that sort of thing? Awesome, great, thank you for being here. But so many designers are unaware that this is even a tool at their disposal. That you could actually use music to provide positive or negative feedback to the player. They don't even know that it's an option. And I think that comes, frankly, from the cinematic culture, that we're so used to looking to cinema as a paradigm for how games should work, that we don't stop to think about that in cinema, audio is often a largely post-production art form, whereas in games, it really shouldn't be because of the interactivity and the intricacies of it. They should, in some ways, I think it should be designed right alongside level design. So, how precisely does this work? For me, there are really two parts to this, and it's taken from something called the, oh gosh, I wish I wrote it down. Elaboration likelihood model, which is also an advertising thing. And there are two parts. It works on us as human beings and how we can use it as the tool in the game. First is the central route, which basically requires direct focus and active thinking and very careful cognition. And the second, of course, is peripheral, more indirect and subconscious ways that it can affect the player. So much more like, an example would be like the wine study, for example. That the player, or pardon me, the customers are aware that they're hearing music, but they're not focusing on it. It's having a sort of peripheral effect on them. So how can we use music to communicate with the player in games using these ideas? So I've identified, broadly speaking, I tried to break it down to 4 different ways that music can be implemented and designed to communicate with the player, and I'm not going to pull any punches on this. I think these are somewhat arbitrary, completely. I mean, once we've talked about it, you get the idea, but I think that like data-driven could also be considered event-driven. It really kind of depends on how it's implemented in the back end, and we can debate that, all day. But I thought it was important to try and delineate 4 different things that we can use and point to as examples. So, we're going to dive right into game data. And the core of this idea sort of centers on allowing game data to drive the adaptive music in such a way to communicate information to the player. And when I say game data, I am referring specifically to any data related directly to the game mechanic. And generally that means math, like floats or integers or bools or even strings occasionally, if that's the way you're thinking about it. But any variables that translate to information which could be important to the player and can drive the adaptive system. So the first time I started playing with this idea was in our first game at Worthing in Moncrief, which was a procedurally generated murder mystery game called A Matter of Murder. And when I started working on A Matter of Murder, I was watching this, a really pretty terrific TV show called Inspector Morse. Has anyone seen it? Yeah? If you have not seen it, and I guess that's most people who check it out, it's pretty awesome. As well, I mean, it's the audio stuff is pretty fun, but there are also really good mysteries. But anyway, the dashing young fellow with the lute, his name is Barrington Fellow, and he was the composer on the Chief Inspector Morse series, and he did something that I thought was really, really clever and super smart. And when he sat down to write the main theme for Chief Inspector Morse, he, using Morse code, wrote out the main theme's rhythm to spell out the word Morse. And I thought, I've forgotten what rabbit hole I was in on the internet when I discovered this. But I thought, oh my gosh, that's really smart. Like, that's super clever. But what absolutely blew my mind was when, and I don't think he did this for every episode, but he talked about, again, using Morse code and the rhythms to spell out the name of the murderer in the underscoring of an episode. And that blew my mind. The idea that the entire time that you're watching the show, the orchestra is actively trying to tell you who the killer is. They're actively working to give you a clue to the answer to the puzzle. And that's what I decided that I wanted to do. I really wanted A Matter of Murder to be able to do that for the player. So A Matter of Murder is a procedurally generated murder mystery game whereby the player is solving for 3 different logic puzzles in any one time. So there's one puzzle that will give you the murderer, one the weapon, and one the motive. And there are pools of these 3 logic puzzles so that you can randomly choose one from each and it will string together a new puzzle every time you play. So when I sat down to write the music, and I used Wise, this interactive music system, to do it, I used a very familiar technique for the composers in the room. It's a vertical layer. So by having all the musical tracks stacked up on top of each other like this, we can fade the volumes in and out as needed, depending on what the player is doing. So, on the top track, you'll notice there's a bed of strings, which is actually playing the entire time, and then there are solo instruments that can pop in and out as needed. So using real-time parameter controls, or in this case variables, I tied each instrument in the orchestra to the answer to one of the puzzles that the player is looking to solve, depending on where you are and what you're doing. So for example, if you're interviewing the murderer, you might hear a trombone join the orchestra. Or if you're in the room with the murder weapon or some evidence, you might hear a bassoon or a flute join the ensemble, that sort of thing. And since the mystery is generated on the fly, so too is the instrumentation. So they're dealt to the instruments like cards. So this one might be an example of how it might be one playthrough, but the next playthrough could actually be completely different. So let's get an example of what this looks like in the game. So in this short slice, you'll see the player enter the drawing room and chat with Major Thomas, who is the angry fellow in the swimming costume. And he is the murderer. And he's represented by a solo sort of marcato violin. And then the player will leave and enter the study, which also happens to have evidence that leads the player to the motive and the murder weapon in the room. And so you'll hear a duet of the trombone and bassoon. And it sounds a little like this. string fade away. There goes back to the map. The instruments come out of the ensemble. Awesome. All right. So, in this case, for A Matter of Murder, the puzzle answers serve as the game data. And the game manipulates the volume of each instrument assigned to that data to actively drop clues to the player. And while we found in testing that players were never able to draw a direct correlation between the orchestra and the game, they were never able to say, well, okay, so the knife was obviously represented by the trombone in this playthrough. They did respond to having noticed the change in the music, and it was enough for them to be like, oh, the music's different, something changed. Something must be important nearby. And for me, that's a win. Because it does suggest that the player is subconsciously, peripherally being influenced by the music that they're hearing. And in this particular case, I actually think I would argue it's a successful execution of the detective's sort of sixth sense that they might have in any mystery, that idea that there's something here, I just can't put my finger on it. And I want to be clear, here's the real rug pull, actually, is that none of these techniques I'm going to share with you today are new ideas. We've actually used all of them before, but I think it's really important to know that these tools exist. Because I find when I talk to designers, it's completely new ideas to them sometimes. And so I make it my mission that like music really should be this connected to the gaming experience. So, and these have been used in video games since very early in the medium. In fact, in terms of game data driving the music, the first example that people may know of and think of is actually Space Invaders. The game's 3-note score, that bump, 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 is actually completely driven by the data in the game. The number of enemies on the screen. I love that as a button. So, yeah, I mean, the game data is driven by the number of enemies on stream, and it drives the tempo of the music. For our purposes, it's not really giving new information. You could argue it's redundant because we can see the number of enemies that are on the screen. But it's still an example of game data. And another old console game, so lots of these examples are going to be old, that used game data and music, but this time to inform the player. Who played an original Nintendo game called Wizards and Warriors? Yeah? This one is super fun, actually, I think, but very old. So, but it's the score is driven by the health bars, in this case. When the player's health bars fall below 4 bars, the music switches to from whatever it's the boss theme or fighting theme, it switches to a you are dying theme to tell the player that, you better get health soon or be careful. So, game data, player's health, when it gets too low, the system switches to tell the player that you're dying. And it's really terrific, I think, especially if you're really focused on killing the boss and you're not paying attention to your health meter at all. It's a great way to signal to the player you're in trouble and you'd better do something soon. Another more modern game that uses game data to drive the score. Anyone heard of Them's Fightin' Herds by Main 6? I think it's still in early access, but it's a really adorable 2D Smash-style fighting game with a brony theme. And I'm not positive because I haven't spoken to the designers or anything, but my understanding of the music is that it is, similarly to Wizards and Warriors, actually tied to the player's health. But because it's like Smash, you have two styles of themes that are going on at the same time, and it will always play the style of the player that is winning. So for this next example, there are two combatants, one called Arizona. I think it's actually the one on the screen that you see right now, that sort of cow type character. And she's got a very, as you might have guessed, sort of cowboy theme. And Velvet, is that it? Yes, Velvet is the other one, and she's got a very cold, slightly electric sound. There are lots of bells and almost a theremin sounding instrument for her style. So there's a nice contrast there. But you'll notice the style shift when one player starts to take over in terms of beating the other. It's pretty string heavy. So, game data. Player's health and the adaptive system fades in the instrumentation and fades it out, depending on when the player is winning. And it's a good way to, in real time, report to the player on how they're doing. So, there's some ideas in terms of game data. Now, moving on to our next tool, using game events to alter the music to present new information to the player. And again, this is something we are very used to seeing now. Some games warn the player that they're in danger when the game switches from exploration to battle music. And this is another old example, but it's actually my absolute favorite in terms of how effective it is. Does anyone recognize this tune? Anyone? Any guesses? No. It's the original Alone in the Dark. And it's really it's very effective because I think partially the game mechanic itself, because you can't fight the creatures that are in that house. Like you've got to find another way of dealing with them most of the time. And the music always goes off before you see the enemy. And the response is Pavlovian. You freak out when you hear those chord changes. It's terrifying. But it's a great warning. So, new enemy enters the area, and it switches from exploration to battle music to warn the player that they're in danger. Another game that uses an alternate technique to impart information is L.A. Noire. When you're searching a crime scene, there's a very specific investigation theme will play, and the music stops when you've found all the clues, or if you wander off the crime scene and you're not in the area where there's clues, the music will stop. Just to let you know there's nothing here. Move along. You're in the wrong spot. So when the player leaves the zone, music switches off, telling the player they won't find anything. So, and you could argue in this case it's the absence of music, but I would still actually include that because silence is an important element. They also use piano chimes to let the player know how they're doing when they're interrogating a suspect. The chimes are different when you're correct about your assertion and when you're completely wrong. And that's kind of key for me, is that it's presenting new information to the player. something that it's a kind of feedback for them. It's allowing the music to give the player clues about elements that might not be obvious and giving them sort of a peek under the hood as to what's going on. So those are some examples of music responding to game events. So let's look at an example of music being used as a puzzle, or sort of gamified music. Nintendo loves to do this, and I think that's great. I'm sure, has everyone played the Ocarina of Time?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite examples of it, is that in the Lost Woods, they use music to guide you through that maze. So at any time, if you take a wrong turn, it will send you back to start. But if you're paying attention to the music, you can actually follow the music all the way through the maze to its end. And that sounds about like this. I hope you'll be able to tell. So, the path through the maze is revealed to the player by the music, by it panning in the direction that they need to go next. And you just sort of breadcrumbs, it leads the player through the game. And this has been used in other games as well, actually. I think another example is in God of War, one of the God of War games, in the Desert of Lost Souls. Like, you actually have to follow the siren song to get out of the desert, otherwise you'll die. Probably without water or something. I actually didn't play this one. But another tool you can use to communicate with players is actually leitmotif. For those of you that are not composers in the room and don't know, leitmotif is a sort of short, recurring musical phrase that's often associated with a person, a place, or an idea. And I think it can sometimes be a tough tool to use well. I have not used it well all the time. I'm perfectly willing to admit. But there are some really, really solid, I think, examples of it being used to communicate with players. And our first example is in possibly, arguably, one of the best point-and-click adventure games of all time, King's Quest VI. It's another oldie. In this game, you play Prince Alexander, and he has to solve inventory object puzzles by navigating and exploring a series of islands. So on this particular island, the first island, he meets, it's called the Isle of Wonder. He meets this character called the Bookworm. And Alexander needs a rare book, and this is how he's going to get it, is from this character. But on the Isle of Wonder, this is the music you hear. Lots of pipes, woodwinds, sort of thing. Very quirky. I actually love this tune. So, when he visits the Isle of the Beast, he encounters this creature, and this music is played. So the instrumentation is different, right? Maybe pizzicato strings, lots of harpsichord, but it's clearly the same tune. So, moving on. But so this little creature, is the answer to the puzzle. He will go with you, and if you give him to the bookworm, you'll be able to get the rare book. So it's a very conscious choice, I think, from the composer to use leitmotif to connect these two characters together. So hopefully that while you're exploring the islands, when you meet this, he's called the dangling participle. When you meet him, hopefully you'll think, oh gosh, maybe I should go back to the bookworm. Because he is the answer to that puzzle. So, leitmotif connects the two characters or locations to drop additional clues to the player to help them solve the puzzle. And I find, as a composer, it's actually really difficult to give, or as a sound designer even, to give talks on audio without mentioning iMuse. Who knows what iMuse is here? Oh, really? Thank you.
Well, now we do.
Right? I am honored to be able to share with you. So iMuse was a proprietary adaptive music tool used by LucasArts in the 90s. And they used it on a number of games that they published. And our next example used leitmotif and the iMuse system together. And in this example, I think, is possibly the best example of leitmotif to communicate with the player in real time. So this clip is, I hope, about to make my next point for me. I actually deliberately removed the audio from this clip because I don't need to play it. Everybody in the room already knows what this sounds like. And that's why I think that its execution is so successful. Because they didn't need to explain the themes and what they meant to the players, because the players already knew. And if you'd never seen the movies or anything, then you would probably play the game and not notice how intricate the music design is. But it's pretty clear that the composers intentionally, dynamically rearranged John Williams' music into a flexible combat system. And they used themes like the Rebel Fanfare and the Imperial March to inform players of events that were happening real time during combat. And it's really, I think it's the best possible example of using leitmotif. Does anyone have any guesses as to what the game is? Go ahead.
It's X-Wing.
It sure is. It absolutely is X-Wing. It will come up in a minute, I hope. In all its MIDI glory. Midi-glorians? I apologize. So, for those of you that have not played it, X-Wing is a Star Wars flight simulator that puts you in the cockpit of an X-Wing fighter, which is super cool. And they use the iMuse system to adapt the music to the player's actions and events in-game so that they could report on things as they happen. And they used elements of the score to do it. So when reinforcements arrive, for example, you'll hear the Rebel Fanfare. Or when more TIE fighters enter the sector, you're going to hear the Imperial March. Additionally, when you blow up some of the other ships, you'll hear a victory fanfare of some kind, and it's pretty awesome. So, getting an idea what that sounds like. be fair, I'm not positive that it was absolutely by design that the music was intended to inform the players and offer feedback on what they're doing, but it was immensely successful. And I know this because they decided to re-release the game in 1998, and they removed the adaptive music in favor of higher quality, perhaps, but thoroughly inflexible CD music. And we live in the age of the internet, where people have opinions. And one of the aspects, as frequently hailed as superior, is the adaptive music. And despite the use of MIDI instruments, one of my favorites is the bottom one here. While graphics aren't as good as the ones in the 1998 versions, the music is so damn immersive, I don't even notice the crappy picture. And for me, that says it all. And so I think it's really key for an audience with agency, for an audience that can actually respond to what's happening in real time, is that we think of the music on some level in terms of a conversation. And that we want to think about the sonic experience as an attempt to communicate with the player. And I'm not saying that you always want to make that choice. It really does depend on the experience that you're crafting. But and we're still learning on how players respond, and we are aware that they do have a narrow bandwidth, and you do really want to have a very clean mix for sure in your audio. Like, you want it to be very communicative, but that is overall in terms of everything. But I do think that it should be considered. It should be actively dismissed that music will not be this intricate in the experience. I think it should be, I do strongly believe that it's a tool that should be on every designer's shortlist. Because for me, it allows the entire experience to be more involved in and of itself. In terms of meaningful scoring, like, what does meaningful mean? And for me, it actually means that everything is connected in the experience, and that all the layers are working together to build a cohesive artistic experience. And for me, music needs to be part of that experience. And I'm also a really big fan of experimentation. I think it's important to explore and take new risks and try new things. And as a medium, as I said at the beginning, I do feel like we often look too much to cinema as a paradigm on how things should work, and focusing on what's different, and I think embracing that different, the idea that this audience has agency, and embracing that is going to actually bring game music to the next level. And will help in terms of innovating and trying new ways of engaging the player. And that's it for me. I hope you've found this at least somewhat interesting. For my part, I've really enjoyed experimenting with these design ideas, and I hope they're interesting and helpful to you, and hopefully we can explore them together. With that in mind, I leave you with the words of Koji Kondo, who said once in a Wired interview that video game music must enhance the gameplay and make it more enjoyable, not just sit there and be something that plays while you play the game, but is actually part of the game. And they are very much words I take to heart. So, thank you so much. And if there are questions, I will happily attempt to provide an alibi. Yes?
Hi. So this is a question that I like asking people who do audio, because I'm not a person who does audio, but as someone making indie games, I'm usually working with someone to make my audio. And I was wondering specifically for like adaptive music systems, do you have any like best practices of communication, of sort of like what like parts of my game or gameplay that I feel could use adaptive music, and how to communicate that with a composer I may be working with? Sort of like what I'm looking for in which parts of the game, or how they can communicate back to me sort of like what their vision is. Basically like facilitating that communication between like game development and audio design for the game.
Great. That's a great question. And that's, just to be clear, the question is, how do you facilitate the communication in terms of team members, or in terms of how do you communicate figuring out what the data is?
I think a
A little bit of both. So, so in terms of, I'm going to apologize for this before I start. So in terms of team communication, keeping that door open, checking in with your team members if they're not, like, if you're not in the same office space, checking in with your audio designers and composers at least once a week. Have a meeting on your schedule at least once a week, honestly. And half an hour, you don't even have to be there for the entire half an hour just to check in, make sure everything's on the same page. And having it in the book makes sure that you will do it, and even if it's having a conversation in terms of, how are you doing today sort of thing, like, oh, right, there's this thing that I need to tell you about. Because there have been projects I have worked on as a designer where there are new, in this case it was monsters going into the game, and I didn't know about it until they were tweeting about it on Twitter. And that's a problem. That's a communication issue. Like, you do want to make sure everyone's on the same page. In terms of, and at least one meeting a week, one check-in, if not more, is a great way to make sure that happens, at least on some level, right? So in terms of facilitating game data or events and how making that score interactive in that way, my advice is to ask yourself, what does the player need to know? What is the most important thing the player needs to know? And there can be, levels of that. And then how can I communicate that information? And that really wholly depends on the experience that you're trying to build. So like if you're doing something I'm dying to try, but not dissimilar perhaps to the Zelda experience, is if you're building a roguelike game where the map is different every time you play, maybe the music helps you navigate it in some way. Maybe instrumentation represents certain things, and that can help get you through the experience depending on what that is. But it really depends on what it is that you're building. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, of course. Thank you for asking. Dan?
So why did you choose X-Wing instead of subverting all our expectations with the intro to TIE Fighter? Because in the intro to TIE Fighter, it plays the Empire theme instead of the regular Star Wars theme. You could have tricked all of us, except me.
I don't think I knew that.
Play TIE Fighter, it's better.
Apart from the music, right? That's a fun question, though. Thank you. Other questions, anybody? Yes.
So this is kind of just a confirmation.
Sure.
As a game is developing, maybe like narratively, and decisions are being made of like what it's going to encompass. As someone creating the audio, are you like constantly adapting to that? Like, do you make an initial score and then change it, or do you like begin but then wait to see what more information you get? How do you approach that?
I think that can be different for everybody. In my personal experience, I find the best design comes from iteration. And I don't think that's restricted to music. I think that's everything. I think the more that you play it, the more that you do it, the more that you iterate on it, the more you learn from the experience and the more you can put back into it. So for me, I mean, I tend to iterate a lot. And it's the only way, I mean, that's, in some ways, I think that's the best way to try new things, is you've got to throw something it's throwing pasta, right? Throw it at the wall, see what sticks. Go back to the drawing board, try again. And you keep the stuff that sticks, right? So for me, yeah, I find that iteration is the best design. Great question. It's a good design question. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? Yes?
Them's Fighting Herd is not like Smash Bros.
Why not?
Because Smash Bros is a platform fighter, and Fighting Herd is a traditional 2D fighter like Street Fighter, but it's actually made in the Skullgirls engine, so it's most like that.
I stand corrected, Mitchell.
So much concern.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will make sure I describe it differently next time. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.